My name is Laurel Bennett, and I am 35 years old, and on a Thursday morning in April, I sat in the law office of Mitchell and Associates in a small town outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and watched my three cousins, Brett, Jordan, and Monica, laugh out loud when the estate attorney read that my uncle had left me his entire $9 million farm, all 480 acres of dry, rocky land that hadn't turned a profit in 15 years, and Brett actually slapped the table and said, "Enjoy your Dust Bowl, Laurel," while Jordan smirked and said, "Hope you like tumbleweeds." And Monica whispered something to her husband that made him chuckle, and the attorney looked uncomfortable and asked if I had any questions, and I smiled the kind of smile that comes from knowing something nobody else in the room knows. And I said, "No, I'm good." And I didn't tell them that 3 months earlier my uncle had sent me a locked metal box with a note that said, "Open this after I'm gone," and inside. That box was a geological survey report dated 6 weeks before his death that showed an estimated 73 million barrels of recoverable oil sitting underneath the northwest quarter of the property and a signed mineral rights lease with an energy company that would start paying royalties 60 days after his passing, and I didn't say a word because I wanted to watch their faces when they figured it out on their own. Let me take you back because you need to understand that my Uncle Ray was not the kind of man anyone expected to die rich. He was the kind of man who wore the same work boots for 10 years and drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it, and lived alone in a farmhouse that hadn't been updated since 1973. And my cousins had spent their entire lives treating him like he was one bad harvest away from poverty, and treating me like I was wasting my time every Sunday. I drove out to his place to have dinner with him. I grew up in Tulsa with my mother, who was Ray's younger sister, and my father, who worked in insurance, and we didn't have much, but we had enough. And my mother always spoke about her brother with a kind of sad fondness, like he was a good man who had made bad choices, and the bad choice she referred to was staying on the family farm after their parents died, instead of selling it and moving to the city like she had. And every time she talked about Ray, there was this unspoken message that he had settled for less and she had chosen more. My cousins were the children of my mother's older sister, and they grew up in a suburb with a pool and new cars every few years, and parents who made sure everyone knew they were doing well. And Brett went to law school, and Jordan went into commercial real estate, and Monica married a man who owned a chain of car dealerships, and all three of them looked at Uncle Ray's farm the same way you'd look at a museum exhibit, something interesting from a distance, but not something you'd ever want to be part of. I started visiting Uncle Ray when I was 16 because my mother asked me to drop off a birthday gift, and when I got there, he was sitting on his porch fixing a fence post, and he looked up and said, "You must be Laurel," and I said yes, and he said, "You want some iced tea?" and I said sure, and I ended up staying for 3 hours just talking, and I went back the next weekend and the weekend after that, and it became the thing I did every Sunday for 19 years. My cousins visited maybe twice a year, always on holidays and always for less than an hour, and they would walk through his house and make comments about how he should update the kitchen or sell some of the land, and Ray would nod and smile and say, "Maybe someday," and the moment they left, he'd look at me and say, "They think I'm a fool," and I'd say, "Why do you care what they think?" And he'd say, "I don't, but it's interesting to watch people assume they know your situation when they've never once asked about it." Uncle Ray taught me how to drive a tractor and how to read soil and how to fix an engine with spare parts and duct tape. And on quiet evenings, we'd sit on his porch and he'd tell me stories about my grandparents and about the years he spent working oil rigs in West Texas before he came back to the farm. And he told me once that people think land is only valuable if it's producing something visible, but the most valuable things are usually underground. When I was 23, I graduated with a degree in environmental science and got a job with a consulting firm that did land assessments and water quality testing, and I worked my way up, and I made decent money, and I bought a small house in Tulsa. And I kept visiting Uncle Ray every Sunday, and my cousins kept not visiting at all. 3 years ago, Uncle Ray called me on a Wednesday night and said, "Laurel, I need you to come out here this weekend. I want to show you something." And when I got there, he took me out to the northwest section of the property where the land rolled, into low hills covered in dry grass and scrub brush, and he said I had a company come out here last month to do some tests, and I said, "Tests for what?" And he said, "Oil," and he handed me a folder. I opened it and read the report, and my hands started shaking because the numbers were staggering. The survey estimated recoverable reserves that could be worth hundreds of millions, depending on market prices and extraction costs. And I looked at him and said, "Uncle Ray, do you understand what this means?" And he said, "I do. And I also understand that if I develop this now, the whole family is going to come crawling out asking for a piece of it." And I don't want that. I want this to go to someone who was here because they wanted to be, not because they wanted something. He told me he was going to lease the mineral rights to an energy company quietly and set up the terms so that the lease wouldn't activate until after his death, and he was going to leave me the entire property in his will. And I said, Uncle Ray, your kids are going to lose their minds. And he said, I don't have kids. Laurel, my nephews and nieces are the closest thing I've got, and out of all of them, you're the only one who ever acted like I mattered. And I tried to argue with him. I told him he should split it. I told him it would cause problems, and he said, good, let it cause problems. Maybe they'll finally realize that people aren't valuable because of what they own. They're valuable because of who they are, and you're the only one who ever treated me like I was worth your time. He passed away 4 months later, heart attack in his sleep, and he was 71 years old, and I was the one who found him because I had come out that Sunday like I always did, and he was in his chair on the porch with a book on his lap, and he looked peaceful, and I sat with him for a long time before I called anyone. The funeral was small, and my cousins showed up in dark clothes and somber faces, and Brett gave a speech about how Uncle Ray was a hardworking man who valued family, and I sat in the front row and said nothing, because I knew Ray would have laughed at the irony. The will reading was scheduled 2 weeks later, and my cousins showed up looking relaxed, like they were about to hear something that would benefit them, and when the attorney read that Ray had left his entire estate to me, including the farm, the house, and all assets valued at approximately $9 million based on a recent land appraisal, Brett laughed and said, $9 million for that place. Are you kidding? And Jordan said that land hasn't made money in decades, and Monica looked at me with something close to pity and said, Laurel, I hope you know what you're getting into. That farm is a money pit. I didn't correct them. I didn't say anything. I just thanked the attorney and left. And I went home and I opened the metal box my uncle had left me, and inside was the survey report, the signed lease agreement, and a handwritten note that said, Laurel, they're going to think I left you nothing. Let them think that for a while. It'll be funnier when they find out the truth. I love you, kiddo. The lease activated 60 days after his death, and the energy company sent a team to start preliminary drilling, and within 3 weeks they confirmed the survey results and sent me the first royalty payment projection, and the number was so large, I had to read it twice. The lease terms gave me 18% royalty on all extracted oil, and based on current production estimates, I would be receiving approximately $230,000 per month once full production started. And the lease term was for 25 years. I didn't tell anyone, I didn't post about it, I just kept going to work and living my life, and then one afternoon my cousin Jordan called me and said, Laurel, I don't know if you've seen this, but there's drilling equipment on Uncle Ray's land. And I said, yeah, I know, and he said, do you know what they're doing? And I said, they're extracting oil. And there was a long pause, and he said, what are you talking about? And I said, Uncle Ray leased the mineral rights before he died. The property is sitting on top of an oil reserve, and Jordan went very quiet, and then he said how much, and I said enough, and I hung up. Brett called an hour later and said, we need to talk about this oil thing. And I said, there's nothing to talk about. The property is mine, the mineral rights are mine, the lease is in my name. And he said, Laurel, this is family money. And I said, no, Brett. This is my money from a man who left it to me because I was the only one who showed up, and he said, you can't keep all of it, and I said, watch me. Monica sent a long email about how Uncle Ray would have wanted us to share, and how it wasn't fair that I got everything, and how we should sit down as a family and figure out a fair distribution. And I deleted it without responding because the entitlement was so thick I could barely read through it. The story got out because small towns talk, and within 2 months everyone knew that the farm my cousins had laughed at was producing oil, and that I was receiving royalty checks that most people don't see in a lifetime, and my cousins stopped calling and started avoiding me at family events, and my mother asked me once if I felt guilty, and I said, no, Mom, I feel grateful. And she said, Uncle Ray really loved you, didn't he? And I said, yeah, he did. And he showed it by making sure I'd be taken care of, and she nodded and didn't ask again. I kept Uncle Ray's house exactly the way it was. I didn't renovate it or modernize it. I kept his boots by the door and his coffee mug on the counter, and every Sunday I still drive out there, and I sit on the porch and I watch the drilling equipment work in the distance. And I think about the fact that my uncle spent his whole life being underestimated by people who thought land was only worth what you could see on the surface. And he knew the whole time that the real value was buried deep. And patience was the only thing that mattered. I donated $500,000 to a scholarship fund for kids in the county who want to study agriculture or geology, and I named it after Uncle Ray. And I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because he believed that people who work the land and understand what's underneath it are the ones who build things that last. And I used part of the royalties to pay off my house, and I invested the rest, and I'm building wealth that my future kids will inherit. And every time I sign a check or approve a transfer, I think about my cousins laughing in that law office, and I smile because they looked at a gift and saw a burden, and I looked at a burden and saw exactly what my uncle wanted me to see: a legacy. If you've ever been the person who showed up when no one else did, if you've ever been underestimated or dismissed because people couldn't see the value in what you were doing, I need you to hear this. The people who laugh at you now won't be laughing. When the truth comes out and you don't owe them an explanation, you don't owe them a piece of what you built, and you sure as hell don't owe them a seat at a table they never wanted to sit at until they saw what was on it. And the best thing you can do is let them live with their assumptions while you live with your truth, because the people who know your value don't need to be convinced, and the people who don't know it don't deserve to benefit from it.